welcome to the channel Chronicles of Shadows. Today's story takes us to 1861. Her name was Celia, and for 17 years she fed the Beaumont family exactly what they demanded. Plate after plate, course after course. Butter, sugar, gravy, meat, until they grew heavy, slow, obese with excess. Then, in one night, the enslaved woman did something the parish would spend decades pretending never happened. This is not an easy story. Pause. Listen closely. Before we begin, subscribe and tell us in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your voice keeps these lives remembered, not erased. On April 12, 1861, while Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, a quieter revolution began in the Louisiana bayou. No flags, no speeches, just a kitchen fire, and a woman who had spent 17 years watching her masters like a patient predator. By sunrise, the Beaumonts would find one thing that felt like a curse. An empty plate in the master's seat. And what they did not know, what none of them could imagine, was that Celia had been preparing for this moment meal by meal, for 17 years. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Magnolia Grove Plantation sat 12 miles northwest of Baton Rouge, tucked into the damp, fertile lowlands where Thompson Creek bent lazily toward the Mississippi River. The land there was rich enough to forgive almost any mistake. Cotton grew thick and obedient in its fields, white bowls bursting open each autumn like promises kept. The Beaumont family liked to say the land itself favored them. What they never admitted was how much blood, sweat, and silence had been pressed into that soil to make it so generous. By 1844, Magnolia Grove covered more than 2,000 acres. Nearly 900 enslaved people lived and worked there, their labor producing close to 900 bales of cotton each year. The numbers were written carefully in ledgers, inked neat and unemotional. Weight, yield, profit, loss. No ledger recorded screams. No ledger recorded prayers whispered into dirt. The main house rose at the center of it all, a Greek revival mansion with 6 white columns and a porch so wide that visitors joked it could host a ballroom on its own. Inside were 14 rooms furnished with imported rugs, carved mahogany, and portraits of dead Beaumont men staring sternly from gilded frames. Guests from New Orleans made the 3-day journey upriver not for the architecture, but for the table. Dinner at Magnolia Grove was an event. 7 courses. English china. French crystal. Food so rich it left grown men sweating and laughing, loosening their belts as if excess itself were a mark of success. People spoke of those meals for months afterward. They praised the sauces, the biscuits, the desserts so delicate they seemed impossible in the Louisiana heat. Almost no one ever asked who made them. 50 feet behind the main house stood a separate brick building, the kitchen house, constructed to keep fires away from the mansion. It was there, in that sweltering room, that Celia first stood on the morning of March 3, 1844, and understood the shape of her future. She was 14 years old. The kitchen smelled of old smoke and animal fat, of flour ground into wooden surfaces by decades of hands. One wall was dominated by a massive hearth, iron pots hanging from a swinging crane over glowing coals. A brick oven yawned black and scarred from constant use. 2 narrow windows offered little mercy from the heat. In summer, the temperature inside often rose past 110 degrees. Celia took it all in without speaking. Fear pressed at her chest, sharp and insistent, but she forced it down. Fear, she had already learned, was useless unless it was turned into attention. Her mother had taught her that. Dinah. The last time Celia had seen her mother, she had been standing barefoot on an auction block in South Carolina mud, the hem of her dress soaked and brown. Dinah's hands had been rough from years of cooking, scarred by burns and blades, but her grip had been steady as she pulled her daughter close. "Remember everything," she whispered as the auctioneer called out bids. "Watch them. Learn them. They think we are nothing. That is their weakness. Make yourself necessary." Celia remembered those words as she stepped into the kitchen at Magnolia Grove. She remembered them as the overseer explained her duties without once looking her in the eye. She remembered them when she learned that the previous cook, an elderly woman named Hester, had died 3 weeks earlier, 41 years in that same kitchen, then gone, replaced without ceremony. That first evening, Marguerite Beaumont sent word that there would be guests for dinner. A judge from Baton Rouge and his wife. Celia had 4 hours. She did not know the temper of the oven. She did not know where ingredients were stored. She did not know what the Beaumonts liked or hated. But her hands knew what to do. They moved almost on their own, guided by memory older than fear. She roasted chicken until the skin crackled and shone. She made rice the Carolina way, each grain separate, steamed just enough. She found wild herbs growing behind the kitchen and crushed them into a sauce thick with butter. She baked biscuits that rose high and pale, steam sighing from their centers when broken open. For dessert, she made a simple cake sweetened with molasses and pecans. When the dishes went out, the kitchen fell silent. An hour later, a servant returned with empty plates and wide eyes. They want more. By the end of the night, the judge's wife had asked for the cake recipe 3 times. Marguerite Beaumont declared the biscuits acceptable, which in that house counted as high praise. Henri Beaumont leaned back in his chair, smiling in the satisfied, dangerous way of a man who believed himself well served by the world. Celia slept on a pallet in the corner of the kitchen that night, her body aching, her mind racing. She had survived her first test. She would survive many more. Word spread quickly. Magnolia Grove had found its cook. Not just a replacement but something rare. Invitations poured in. Henri Beaumont became popular in a way he had never been before. People wanted his table. Wanted his favor. For Celia, success meant something different. It meant invisibility. She became the kitchen. The hands that served and vanished. The presence no one bothered to see. She worked 18 hours a day, rising before dawn and collapsing long after dark. She learned the rhythms of the house, the moods of its occupants, the precise times when doors were unlocked and when they were not. And while they ate, she watched. She watched Henri Beaumont count money in his study, his fingers lingering on certain bills. She watched Marguerite Beaumont grow drowsy each evening after her laudanum. She watched the sons argue over debts and pride. She watched everything. None of them noticed her watching. By the time Celia turned 15, Magnolia Grove could not function without her. By 16, the Beaumonts spoke of her as essential. By 17, they no longer remembered a time before her cooking. And that, though none of them understood it, was the most dangerous thing of all. Because Celia was not just feeding them. She was learning them. And years later, when the moment came, that knowledge would matter more than any weapon. It was the beginning of a very long wait. The years that followed blurred together, stitched by seasons and meals. Celia learned quickly that time at Magnolia Grove was measured not by calendars, but by appetites. Spring meant tender greens and new onions pulled from the garden before sunrise. Summer meant heat so brutal it pressed breath from the chest, canning jars lined like soldiers along the walls while sweat dripped into the dirt floor. Fall brought slaughter, hogs screaming, blood steaming in the cooling air, meat salted and hung in the smokehouse. Winter was the only mercy, though even then the fires burned from dark to dark. Through it all, Celia worked. She learned the temperament of the hearth, where the fire burned hottest, where a pot could simmer without scorching. She learned how long butter could sit before turning, how sugar behaved differently in damp air, how to stretch rations without anyone noticing, how to turn scraps into feasts. And she learned people. Henri Beaumont ate like a man afraid the food might disappear if he did not consume it fast enough. He chewed loudly, wiped grease from his fingers onto linen napkins, demanded seconds before finishing first portions. He spoke of refinement while licking sauce from his beard. Celia learned that if she served him bread last, he would overeat everything else first. Marguerite Beaumont ate more slowly, fussing, complaining, finding fault. Too salty. Too bland. Too rich. Too plain. Yet she always finished her plate. Always asked for dessert. Celia learned that Marguerite's criticism meant satisfaction. Silence meant danger. Henri Jr. watched his father closely, mimicking him in ways he did not yet understand. His cruelty showed early, small humiliations, unnecessary punishments, a smile that lingered too long when someone flinched. He gambled recklessly, believing luck was something owed to him by birth. Celia learned when he lost money by how violently he cut into his food. The youngest, Philippe, ate distractedly when home from New Orleans, bored with plantation life, eager to prove himself cleverer than the place that raised him. He barely noticed Celia at all. That was good. Invisibility was safety. Invisibility was freedom of movement. Invisibility allowed Celia to pass through rooms where she did not belong, to hear conversations meant for white ears only. She served coffee during late-night accounting sessions. She cleared plates while debts were discussed. She listened. She remembered. By 1849, Celia had memorized the layout of the main house better than most of the family. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, which windows were never latched because Henri Beaumont disliked the sound of locks. She knew where valuables were kept, where papers were stored, and where no one ever looked. And still no one saw her. When the plantation hosted guests, Celia's food became its own kind of currency. Judges, planters, bankers, politicians. They ate until their faces flushed and their eyes softened. Deals were made across her table. Promises exchanged between bites. More than once, Celia watched men agree to things they would later regret, softened by wine and butter and sugar. She learned something important in those moments. Men who believe themselves powerful are weakest when satisfied. By 1850, her value was formally recorded. An insurance document listed her worth at $2,000, more than triple her purchase price. Excellent health. Skilled in all forms of cookery. Essential to household operations. Essential. That word settled into Celia's mind and stayed there. Essential people were not sold easily. Essential people were protected. Essential people were allowed small freedoms if it meant maintaining comfort. A longer leash. A blind eye turned. Celia used every inch of it. In 1853, she began to change in ways the Beaumonts did not notice. Her body softened, her movements slowed slightly. Loose dresses hid what needed hiding. When the time came, she labored through the night in the kitchen house, aided only by an elderly midwife named Josephine. The child arrived just before dawn. A boy. Celia named him Samuel. She did not cry when she first held him. Tears were dangerous things. Instead, she memorized him. The shape of his mouth, the strength of his grip, the way his eyes seemed already alert, already searching. She understood immediately what he was. Leverage. Not in the way the Beaumonts would someday see him, as property with a price, but as purpose, as boundary, as the line she would never allow to be crossed. She returned to the stove 3 days later. Samuel slept in a basket near the hearth, rocked by the same heat that cooked the meals of the people who owned them both. Marguerite Beaumont noticed only that breakfast arrived on time. "The cook has had a child," she wrote in her diary. "I hope this will not affect her work." It did not, but it changed everything else. At night, when the house slept heavy and full, Celia taught Samuel to speak carefully, to listen more than he talked. Later, she taught him letters, tracing them in ash on the kitchen floor. She taught him numbers by counting loaves and jars. She taught him stories from memory, Bible verses whispered so softly they barely existed. It was illegal. It was dangerous. It was necessary. Celia knew the law. She knew the punishments. She also knew that ignorance was a chain stronger than iron. By the time Samuel was 5, he could read simple words. By 7, he could read the Bible better than most white men who quoted it. And still, the Beaumonts did not see him. They saw a cook's boy, a shadow, a future transaction waiting to happen. What Celia did not yet know, what she could not know, was that all her watching, all her patience, all her careful preparation was leading toward a single overheard conversation. One sentence spoken carelessly over dinner. One decision that would turn 17 years of endurance into action. And when that moment arrived, Celia would not hesitate. Because she had not been waiting to escape. She had been waiting to strike. And the table that made the Beaumonts powerful would be the same place their power began to rot. By the winter of 1860, Magnolia Grove felt heavier than it ever had. The air itself seemed thick with waiting. News from beyond the plantation arrived in fragments. Newspapers passed from hand to hand, rumors carried by wagon drivers, whispers traded between enslaved people in the quarters. South Carolina had seceded. Others would follow. War was coming. Everyone knew it, though few understood what it would mean. Celia understood one thing very clearly: uncertainty made men careless. Henri Beaumont spent more time in his study now, poring over ledgers with a scowl that deepened by the week. Cotton prices were unstable. Credit was tightening. Henri Jr.'s gambling debts, long concealed through creative bookkeeping and quiet loans, had begun to surface like rot beneath paint. Marguerite Beaumont complained constantly of nerves, her laudanum doses increasing, her moods dull and irritable. The household was uneasy, overfed and underprepared. Samuel was 8. That alone would have been enough to keep Celia awake at night. He was no longer the unnoticed child sleeping near the hearth. He ran errands now, carried messages, helped bring in produce from the garden. White eyes had begun to linger on him, measuring, assessing. Celia saw it and felt something cold settle in her chest. Then, in January of 1861, the sentence was spoken. It happened during dinner, as so many dangerous things did. Celia moved silently around the table, refilling glasses, clearing plates. The family spoke in French, as they often did when discussing matters they assumed no enslaved person could understand. They were wrong. Celia had spent 17 years listening. French words had arranged themselves in her mind the way recipes did. Patterns learned through repetition, meaning gathered slowly and precisely. "The Hutchinson debt must be paid by April," Henri Jr. said, cutting into a slab of pork. $4,300. We do not have it. Henri Beaumont grunted. Then we sell. The market is poor. Field hands will bring nothing. Pause. Celia felt it before she heard it. The cook's boy, Henri Jr. said. The room tilted. He is strong. Right. I have already had inquiries. The Hutchinson plantation in Mississippi is looking for young stock. Mississippi. Celia knew that word the way one knows the taste of poison. The Hutchinson plantation sat deep in the delta, land so rich it consumed people. Mortality rates were whispered about, not spoken aloud. Men were worked until they broke. Children vanished. It was known among enslaved people as a place you were sent when someone wanted you erased. He is worth more here, Henri Beaumont said, distracted, chewing. His mother cooks better when he is nearby. She will adjust, Henri Jr. replied. They always do. Celia stood perfectly still. After Easter, Henri Beaumont said finally, let her handle the spring entertaining season first. Then do what you like. After Easter. April. Celia carried the serving dish back to the kitchen. She did not spill it. Her hands did not shake. She finished her duties with the same quiet efficiency she always had. She tucked Samuel into his pallet that night, brushed his hair back from his face, listened to his breathing until it evened into sleep. Then she sat alone in the kitchen house until dawn. There was no panic. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. There was only calculation. 3 months. 3 months until her son was sold south to die. 3 months to do what no enslaved woman was supposed to be capable of doing. Running blindly into the swamps would not save him. Begging would not save him. Violence would not save him. Celia understood something the Beaumonts never had. Systems collapse when you use their rules against them. The first thing she needed was information. Routes. Distances. People who could be trusted. The second was money. Escape was not free. There were bribes to pay, food to buy, silence to secure. The third was time. Time she would steal back, one meal at a time. The very next morning, Celia cooked as she had never cooked before. She increased portions, thickened sauces, added butter where it was unnecessary, sugar where it was indulgent, cream where it slowed digestion and dulled thought. She made the Beaumonts sleepy, satisfied, complacent. They praised her. They did not question her. At night, when the house lay drugged by excess, Celia began to move. It started with Ezekiel, the wagon driver who delivered supplies from Baton Rouge every 2 weeks. A free black man with papers and a careful way of speaking. Celia had noticed him years earlier. The way he listened. The way he looked at the quarters, not with pity but with recognition. She approached him slowly. A loaf of bread one visit. A quiet question the next. Finally, the truth. I need to get north, she whispered. Me and my son. Before April. Ezekiel did not answer immediately. North is long, he said at last. Mexico is closer. I need somewhere they cannot follow. That word follow hung between them. I will ask, Ezekiel said. From that moment on, Celia lived 2 lives. By day, she fed the Beaumonts until they could barely move. By night, she memorized routes drawn on scraps of cloth. Learned names of towns she would never visit in daylight. Counted miles the way she once counted cups of flour. She watched Henri Beaumont open his safe each evening, serving him coffee while his fingers turned the dial. She watched. She remembered. She began hiding food beneath loose floorboards. Dried meat. Hard biscuits. She gathered clothing, sturdy shoes, anything that would survive weeks of walking. She whispered to others in the quarters, careful and deliberate. Be ready. She did not say when. By the time February ended, the plan was no longer a hope. It was a machine assembled piece by piece from the very household that believed it owned her. And when April came, Magnolia Grove would discover the truth too late, because Celia was done waiting. And the sentence they had passed on her son would become the sentence that destroyed them. By February, the Beaumont household began to feel as if it were sinking into itself. The days shortened not by the clock but by energy. Meals stretched longer. Afternoons dissolved into stupor. The family spoke less, moved slower, slept deeper. They blamed the season. They blamed age. They blamed anything but the woman who stood quietly at the edge of the room, refilling plates. Celia cooked with intention now. Not recklessness. Precision. She understood bodies the way she understood ovens. She knew how fat settled, how sugar spiked and then dulled, how alcohol thickened blood and loosened discipline. She served heavy breakfasts that lingered into noon. Dinners that demanded hours to digest. Desserts layered with cream and syrup that left minds fogged and limbs slow. Henri Beaumont gained weight visibly. His belts no longer fit the same. He breathed harder climbing stairs. His gout flared then worsened. Marguerite Beaumont complained of pressure in her chest, of weakness, of needing to lie down after meals. Henri Jr.'s temper grew erratic, sharpened by discomfort and dulled by whiskey. He stayed up later, slept later, noticed less. This was not cruelty. It was strategy. Celia needed them predictable. She needed them unconscious when the moment came. At night, after the house fell silent, she moved through it as she always had, except now she carried purpose instead of plates. She tested doors. She counted steps. She rehearsed movements until they lived in her muscles. The safe in Henri Beaumont's study became the center of her planning. It was a heavy iron box set into the wall behind a portrait of Henry's father, a relic of a man who had once owned fewer acres but felt no less entitled to them. The safe was manufactured in Cincinnati, sturdy, respected, trusted. Henri Beaumont trusted it because he trusted himself. He should not have. Celia had watched him open it hundreds of times. Watched his fingers turn the dial while she stood inches away pouring coffee. Watched the slight pause before each number. Watched him mouth the sequence without realizing it. As of March 1861, the combination was simple. 23 right, 7 left, 31 right. Inside were stacks of paper currency, gold coins wrapped in cloth, Marguerite's jewelry, and the documents that mattered most, the ownership papers. Names, ages, values, proof that human beings could be bought and sold. Those papers would not be leaving Magnolia Grove intact. Money mattered, but papers meant survival. Without documents, slave catchers hesitated. Without proof, arguments could be made. Delays created. Mistakes exploited. Celia understood that forged freedom papers, paired with confidence, could carry a person astonishingly far. She practiced writing at night, copying letters by candlelight, mimicking white hands she had seen sign receipts and letters. Her script was careful, deliberate. Good enough. She did not need perfection. She needed time. Meanwhile, the quarters stirred. Celia spoke quietly to those she trusted. Not all at once. Not carelessly. She let news travel the way it always had, through glances, through pauses, through shared understanding. By late March, people were watching her the way they had once watched Josephine the midwife. With expectation. They knew something was coming. They did not know what. That was intentional. 37 people were ready. 37 people with nothing left to lose. Old Josephine, whose hands had delivered half the plantation. Marcus, young and scarred and angry. Mothers, fathers, single men. A girl barely older than Samuel. Each one carried a different reason but the same decision. April 12th was chosen carefully. War was no longer rumor. It was movement. Men leaving farms. Patrols thinning. Attention pulled north and east. Newspapers screamed of cannon fire and flags. Slave catchers would be slower. Confused. Distracted. Chaos was cover. On the morning of April 12th, Celia rose before dawn as she always had. She built the fire. She kneaded dough. She salted meat. Nothing in her movements betrayed her. The meal she planned for that night was her masterpiece. Roasted pork turned for hours until fat dripped and flared. Fried chicken prepared in seasoned cast iron. Oyster stew thick with cream. Biscuits, dozens of them, split and buttered while still hot. Vegetables drowned in fat. Cornbread soaked in liquor from the pot. 3 pies. A towering cake. And whiskey. So much whiskey. The table groaned beneath it. Henri Jr. invited 2 neighboring planters to join them. Men who wanted to taste the Beaumont table before the world changed. Celia served them all. They ate for hours. They ate past discomfort and into pain. By 10 o'clock, the guests could barely stand. Henri Beaumont loosened his belt, groaning. Marguerite Beaumont declared she would never eat again, then took another slice of cake. Celia watched. She counted breaths. By midnight, the house was silent. She moved first to the shed behind the kitchen, where Samuel waited exactly as instructed. Awake, dressed, ready. He did not ask questions. He took her hand. Then they went to the front of the house. Not the servant's door. The front door. It was unlocked. It always was. Inside, the house smelled of extinguished candles and stale wine. The grandfather clock ticked. Someone snored upstairs. Celia crossed the threshold without hesitation. The study door opened easily. The portrait came down. The safe waited. 23 right. 7 left. 31 right. The click was soft, almost polite. She emptied it completely. Money into the bag. Jewelry into her dress. Papers folded carefully, reverently. 17 years reduced to minutes. Then she did one final thing. She returned to the dining room and placed a single plate at the head of the table. Empty. Beside it, she left a folded paper. 7 words written slowly, clearly. You ate our pain. Now feel hunger. Then Celia walked out of Magnolia Grove. Behind her, the house slept. Ahead of her, 37 people waited in the dark. And by morning, the Beaumonts would wake to a silence louder than cannon fire. The system they trusted had already collapsed. They just did not know it yet. The night swallowed them whole. Clouds rolled in from the Gulf and smothered the stars, turning the bayou into a sheet of black glass. Spanish moss brushed shoulders like damp fingers as the group gathered in the clearing Celia had chosen weeks before. A half-mile from Magnolia Grove, far enough to avoid notice, close enough that no one would lose their way. 37 people stood there breathing quietly, counting heartbeats. Celia did not raise her voice. She did not need to. We walk until dawn, she said. No talking. Stay close. If you fall behind, we do not stop. If you are caught, you do not speak the route. They nodded. Samuel slipped his small hand into hers. She squeezed once hard, then turned north. The first miles passed quickly, feet finding rhythm on paths Celia had walked in daylight pretending to gather herbs. The ground softened as they approached Thompson Creek, water moving unseen but loud enough to threaten them. The crossing point Celia had chosen widened there, shallow enough for children if they moved carefully. They formed a chain. Cold bit up their legs as they stepped in. The current tugged. Someone stumbled and was steadied. No one cried out. On the far bank, they wrung out clothing and moved on, teeth chattering, bodies already exhausted. By the time gray light crept into the trees, they had covered 8 miles. It was not enough. They hid in an abandoned tobacco barn whose roof sagged like an old spine. Inside, hay mold and rot stung the nose. 39 bodies packed together, barely breathing. Children were pressed between adults, told to sleep if they could. Watches were set. No one spoke above a whisper. Morning came. At Magnolia Grove, Henri Beaumont woke late, head pounding, mouth dry. He rang for service. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Downstairs, the dining room waited exactly as it had been left. Congealed food, flies gathering, wine darkening in glasses. At the head of the table sat the plate. Empty. The note trembled in his hands. She is gone, he said finally. The cook is gone. The safe was discovered minutes later. Empty. The quarters an hour after that. Not empty enough. Too empty. By noon, messengers were riding hard. Bells rang. Dogs were gathered. A reward was posted that would climb to $5,000 by the end of the week. Men who had never left their farms saddled horses, drawn by the promise of easy money. But the trail was wrong. Celia had anticipated that. On the second night, she split the group at a crossroads 20 miles north. 3 routes, 3 directions. Old Josephine led 12 west. Marcus took 13 northeast. Celia kept 12 and went north, but not straight. Goodbyes were brief. No promises made. Hope did not need words. The pursuers followed the most obvious path. They were wrong again. Celia turned west into water and brush where dogs lost scent and horses faltered. Bayous slowed the chase. Backwaters erased tracks. They walked in streams for miles, upstream, downstream, anything to confuse the nose that hunted them. They traveled only at night. Food dwindled. Feet split. Children learned to be silent in ways no child should. Once, dogs came close enough that Celia felt their sound in her teeth. She pushed the group into a creek without explanation. They stood in water to their waists until the barking faded and night reclaimed them. Mississippi arrived without ceremony. The land changed. Pines replaced swamp. The air dried. Celia knew the border by instinct, by a loosening in her chest she did not yet trust. They were still not free. On the 8th night, a man named Solomon opened his barn without questions. A free black farmer with careful eyes and quicker hands. He fed them, bandaged feet, hid them behind a false wall. He spoke of war spreading like fire, of patrols thinning, of chances widening. 2 days, he said. Rest. 2 days felt like a lifetime. They left with maps and meal and something harder to carry, belief. The journey became a pattern of near misses and narrow mercy. Tennessee came. Then friends along the way. Marcus rejoined them with his group, thinner but alive. Old Josephine did not. Celia did not ask. She could not. Kentucky pressed them hardest. Patrols thickened. Federal law reached even here. They hid deeper, moved slower, learned to read faces at a glance. The Johnson farm near Louisville sheltered them beneath a barn floor. From there, the river waited. Celia insisted on last passage. She watched the first boat vanish, counted heads when it returned. The second returned. The third carried her and Samuel. The Ohio slid beneath them, black and patient. When the hull scraped Indiana's shore, Celia did not move at once. She sat and breathed and let the truth settle where fear had lived. Free did not feel loud. It felt quiet. They did not stop in Indiana. The law still reached. They moved north through a lattice of hands that fed and hid and hurried them along. Detroit rose at last, the river beyond it shining like a promise kept. Canada was 10 minutes of water. Celia crossed in daylight. Sun on her face. Wind clean. Ground firm. Of the 39 who had left Magnolia Grove, 24 stood together on that shore. Enough. Enough to change everything. Years later, people would argue over numbers and routes and names. They would doubt details. They would question whether a cook could do such a thing. But no one who stood at that river ever doubted the woman who led them there. Celia did not look back. She never needed to. Because behind her, the table that had ruled Magnolia Grove was empty forever. And ahead of her, a life waited. One she would build with the same hands that had once been forced to serve. Freedom did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived quietly, like a door opening onto a room no one had ever described properly. Celia learned this in the first weeks after crossing into Canada, when the body finally understood what the mind had been racing toward for months. In Windsor and then farther east in Ontario, the nights were still. No patrol bells. No dogs. No sudden fists on doors. The silence itself felt dangerous at first, like a trick. Celia slept lightly, waking at every sound, hand reaching automatically for Samuel. It took weeks before her body accepted that no one was coming. The group scattered slowly the way survivors always do. Some had family waiting. Some followed work. Some simply walked until they found a place that felt right. 24 lives unfolding again, each carrying scars that could not be seen. Celia chose Street Catherine's. It was already a refuge, a town thick with stories like hers. Former slaves from Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia. Men who had run alone. Women who had buried children along the way. Families stitched back together by chance and stubbornness. The air there carried a strange mix of grief and beginning. She rented a narrow house near the Welland Canal and did the only thing she had ever been trained to do: she cooked. At first, it was survival. Meals sold cheaply to dockworkers and laborers. Bread, stew, food that filled bellies. But word spread the same way it always had. Quietly. With hunger. By winter, people were calling her place the Freedom Table. No sign hung outside. None was needed. Those who knew came. Newly arrived fugitives crossed the border trembling and found warmth there. Abolitionists traveling the route stopped for supper and listened. Ministers ate and remembered. Celia cooked the way she always had, with attention, with memory, with control. But now, when she finished a dish, she sat at the table and ate it too. Samuel went to school. At first, he walked there stiffly, waiting for someone to tell him he did not belong. No one did. He learned quickly. Faster than the teachers expected. Faster than children who had never known hunger. Celia watched him read by the fire at night, his lips moving silently, and felt something unclench in her chest that had been tight since he was born. Years passed. News traveled north the way it always had, late, uneven, but relentless. Forts fell. Armies marched. Men died in numbers too large to understand. And then, slowly, impossibly, the words that had once seemed like lies became law. Slavery was ending. When word reached St. Catherine's that the 13th Amendment had been ratified, people gathered in churches and kitchens and open fields. Some cried. Some sang. Some sat very still, unable to process a world that had changed too late for too many. Celia did not celebrate loudly. She had been free for years already. She thought instead of Magnolia Grove. Of the kitchen. The safe. The plate. She learned, eventually, what became of the Beaumonts. News like that traveled too, carried by former slaves and ruined men alike. Magnolia Grove collapsed under debts it could no longer hide. Without forced labor and without cash, the land failed them. Henri Jr. fled west. Philippe died in uniform. Marguerite lingered, reduced to dependence, complaining of hunger until the end. Henri Beaumont himself died eating. A heart that had never learned restraint finally gave out. The house burned during the war. No one ever agreed how. Union troops. Accidental fire. Retribution. It did not matter. Only the chimneys remained, standing like accusations. Celia never returned. She did not need to see the ruins. Her life was north now. She cooked for weddings. For funerals. 4 strangers stepping into freedom with nothing but clothes borrowed from kind hands. She hired other women, paid them wages, taught them recipes that had once been whispered on auction blocks. When people asked how she had escaped, she told them the truth. I paid attention. That was all. Samuel grew tall. He studied longer than anyone expected. He became a teacher, then a principal. He spoke calmly about education as if it were a weapon, because he understood exactly what it could do. He married. He had children who would never be owned. Celia lived to see grandchildren who asked questions she never had the luxury to ask. She died in 1892. Her obituary was small. It spoke of kindness, of food, of a woman who fed a community. It did not mention the night she emptied a safe or the sentence she left on a white man's table. That story survived another way. Passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, around tables where people ate freely. It became legend, then warning, then something quieter and stronger than both. A reminder that systems built on hunger can be broken by it, that patience is not submission, that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room is the person no one is watching, and that an empty plate, placed deliberately, can echo longer than cannon fire. Celia never called herself a hero. She called herself a mother, and that was enough. Long after the smoke cleared and the borders hardened into new lines on maps, Magnolia Grove became a place people avoided speaking about in detail. Not because it was unique, there were hundreds like it, but because of how it ended. Plantation owners in East Feliciana Parish preferred neat explanations. Market forces, or bad luck. Anything that did not involve an enslaved woman outthinking them from inside their own house. The official record was thin. Ledgers went missing. Insurance claims were denied. Testimony conflicted. The sheriff's report spoke vaguely of multiple runaways aided by outside agitators. No names were listed. No routes described. The plate was not mentioned at all. It survived only in memory. Former enslaved people spoke of it first, quietly years later when it was safe to do so. Around stoves and church basements, someone would mention a cook who fed a family into blindness. Someone else would add that she left a message so sharp it cut deeper than a blade. The details shifted with each telling. Numbers changed, distances stretched, but the shape of the story held. A woman waited. A woman watched. A woman left with more than she arrived with. White neighbors told a different version when pressed. They said the Beaumonts had been careless. That the cook had help from abolition men. That such intelligence could not have belonged to her alone. It was important to believe that. To believe she had been a tool, not an author. But years later, a small thing surfaced that complicated those denials. In 1878, a lawyer in Baton Rouge cataloging old estate papers found a single loose inventory sheet among unrelated documents. It listed the contents of a safe that no longer existed. Cash, gold, jewelry. And then, at the bottom, in a different hand, ownership papers, missing. The notation was brief. No explanation attached. It was enough. Historians would argue over it for decades. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others suspected theft by soldiers during the war. A few, reading between the lines, understood exactly what it meant. Papers missing were not an accident. Papers missing were a choice. By then, Celia was already gone. In Canada, she aged the way women do when time finally belongs to them. Slowly. Intentionally. She developed arthritis in her hands, the same hands that had turned meat on spits and counted dial turns in the dark. On bad mornings, she sat and let others cook. On good ones, she insisted on seasoning herself. People still came to her table. Not for spectacle. For steadiness. When new arrivals asked her how she endured the journey, she told them the truth. You do not endure, she said. You decide. She did not romanticize it. She spoke plainly of fear, of hunger, of the way the body learns to function without mercy. She spoke of mistakes, of the people who did not make it. She did not soften those parts. They want the story clean, she told a young man once. It was not. That honesty mattered. As the years passed, Celia became something like an anchor in St. Catharines. People measured time by her presence, by whether she was still cooking, by whether the freedom table was open that evening. When she finally closed it, long after Samuel had a family of his own, the town noticed. Her funeral was modest. There were hymns. There was food. There were people who stood quietly, holding memories that did not belong in sermons. No one spoke of Magnolia Grove aloud, but more than one person thought of it. And somewhere, far south of that clean Canadian earth, the ruins of a plantation settled further into the ground. Bricks softened. Chimneys leaned. The land forgot names and remembered only labor. In the decades that followed, historians would write about escapes in numbers and routes. They would catalog conductors and stations. They would focus on famous names because fame is easier to footnote than patience. Celia's story resisted that. It did not fit neatly into categories. She had not fled alone. She had not followed a single conductor from start to finish. She had not relied on sudden violence or miracle rescue. She had stayed. Learned. Used what the system gave her because it had taken everything else. That made people uncomfortable. It suggested something dangerous, that the enslaved were not merely resisting from the margins but from the center. That the kitchen, the ledger, the table itself could be turned into instruments of collapse. That intelligence did not announce itself loudly. It waited. In the early 20th century, a schoolteacher in Ontario assigned her students to write about family history. One boy turned in a paper about his grandmother. He described her cooking, her rules, the way she insisted he finish his lessons before eating dessert. He included a story she had told him once, about a plate left empty on purpose. The teacher underlined the passage and wrote in the margin, "Ask her more." By the time the boy did, she was gone. But others remembered. Stories do not survive because they are written down. They survive because someone needs them. Because they answer a question that keeps returning in different forms. How do you live inside something built to erase you? How do you wait without surrendering? Celia's answer was never a speech. It was an action repeated until it became inevitable. A way of paying attention so complete it looked like obedience to those who did not know what to look for. That is why the Beaumonts failed to stop her. They believed hunger only went one way. They believed the table belonged to them. They were wrong. And that truth, more than the money, more than the loss of labor, more than the ruin of Magnolia Grove, was what haunted them until the end. Because somewhere in the story they could not erase was a simple fact they never learned how to digest. They were not the ones in control. They never had been. And the woman they thought invisible had been counting every bite. Years passed, and with them came a quieter kind of forgetting. Not the mercy of forgiveness, but the erosion that settles when people decide a thing is no longer useful to remember. Magnolia Grove slipped from conversation into footnotes. Then out of those as well. New owners parceled the land. New houses rose where cotton once grew. Children played where the quarters had been, unaware of what the soil held. But the plate endured. Not the porcelain itself, it was almost certainly shattered in the fire that took the house, but the image of it. The idea. The place where something should have been and was not. Former enslaved people who had lived on or near the plantation carried that image north and west as they moved after the war. They spoke of a table so heavy with food it bent under its own abundance, and of the one place where nothing sat at all. They spoke of how that emptiness had frightened the Beaumonts more than violence ever could. Because violence could be answered. Emptiness could not. In East Feliciana Parish, older white residents told the story differently when pressed by grandchildren who asked why the great house had never been rebuilt. They said the cook had been ungrateful. That she had stolen from people who had treated her well. That her success proved she had not been mistreated after all. It was important to frame it that way. Important to believe generosity had been repaid with treachery rather than cruelty answered with calculation. But sometimes the truth leaked through. An old woman, the daughter of a Beaumont neighbor, once told a visiting journalist that her father had returned from Magnolia Grove the day after the disappearance, pale and shaken. He said the table looked wrong, she recalled. Like something had been taken that you couldn't put back. That was as close as she ever came to admitting fear. Celia did not concern herself with how they remembered it. She had learned long ago that memory was a luxury. Survival required focus, not vindication. She spent her later years in rhythms chosen rather than imposed. Morning walks. Cooking when her hands allowed. Teaching grandchildren how to measure by feel instead of numbers. She never taught them the routes. She never described the safe in detail. She did not want the story to become a manual. What she did teach them was attention. Watch, she would say, tapping the table when a child rushed. Everything tells you something if you listen long enough. It was a lesson learned in captivity and carried into freedom without apology. In the 1880s, as Reconstruction curdled into segregation and the promises of emancipation narrowed, people in the North began telling themselves that slavery had been a Southern problem, solved and finished. Celia listened to that the way one listens to bad weather reports. Aware, skeptical, prepared. Freedom, she knew, was not a single crossing. It was a practice. Samuel understood this better than anyone. As a school administrator, he argued with boards that wanted to shorten terms for black children. He insisted on libraries. On discipline that did not humiliate. On standards that assumed ability rather than lack. When challenged, he did not raise his voice. He asked questions. Why should they learn less? Why should they expect less? Why should hunger return in another form? People called him difficult. He took it as a compliment. When Celia grew weaker, he brought his children to sit with her. She told them stories that did not center herself. Stories about Josephine, about Marcus, about people whose names did not appear in books. She spoke of those who had not made it north and refused to let their absence be mistaken for failure. They did not lose, she said once. The road was the loss. After her death, Samuel kept the freedom table closed, but the idea of it traveled anyway. Churches held meals and called them freedom suppers. Mutual aid societies adopted the phrase. In some homes, leaving an empty place at the table became a quiet tradition on anniversaries that were not written down. Not a mourning. A recognition. By the turn of the century, the story had thinned again, condensed into a shape people could carry without discomfort. A clever cook. A daring escape. A happy ending far away. It lost its edges. Its waiting. Its years. But in kitchens, always in kitchens, the fuller version survived. Because kitchens are where people count. Where they learn who eats first and who eats last. Where patience becomes a skill instead of a virtue. Where power reveals itself in small daily ways. Celia's story stayed there because it belonged there. It was never about the theft alone, or the escape, or even the freedom that followed. It was about what happens when a person denied everything except usefulness decides to redefine that usefulness entirely. The Beaumonts believed feeding them made Celia small. They believed appetite was a weakness to indulge, not a pattern to exploit. They believed time favored them. They were wrong on all counts. What Celia understood, and what made her dangerous, was that power grows careless when it assumes permanence. It stops watching. It stops listening. It stops imagining that the quiet figure at the edge of the room might be counting every movement. By the time the plate appeared, the decision had already been made. The outcome had been sealed. The system had consumed itself. That is why the story lingered. Because it was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was not kindness from above. It was the slow, deliberate use of what was available, attention, memory, restraint, until the moment arrived. And when it did, Celia did not hesitate. She stood. She took. She left. And the space she created at that table was never filled again. Not by the Beaumonts. Not by anyone who believed hunger only moved in one direction. There is a moment after any collapse when people begin searching for something simple to blame. A bad decision. A dishonest servant. A single night gone wrong. The Beaumonts tried all of these explanations, first aloud, then silently, then not at all. None of them could account for what gnawed at them in the months that followed. It was not just the loss of money. It was hunger. Not the physical kind at first, but something closer to panic. A realization that the world they had trusted to feed them without effort no longer existed. The war took their sons, their workers, their certainty. Creditors took their land. And the kitchen, once the heart of Magnolia Grove, went cold. Henri Beaumont attempted to hire laborers to replace the enslaved people who had vanished. He offered wages that would not sustain a family and expected gratitude in return. Men came for a day, sometimes two, then left. The cotton rotted in the fields. The house fell into disrepair. Meals shrank. Complaints grew louder. Without Celia, the Beaumont table was ordinary. That was the deepest insult of all. Visitors stopped coming. Invitations dried up. Henri Beaumont's reputation, once built on abundance, withered into something pitted. Marguerite Beaumont grew thinner, not by restraint but by deprivation. She sent letters begging relatives for assistance, describing her circumstances in tones that suggested tragedy rather than consequence. No one answered quickly. By the time the plantation was seized by creditors, the Beaumonts were already ghosts in their own house, moving slowly through rooms too large for them, eating meals that no longer satisfied. Hunger had crossed the table. Far north of that decay, Celia watched the seasons change with a different awareness. In St. Catharines, winter demanded planning. Food had to be stored. Wood had to be cut. There were no enslaved hands to absorb mistakes. Responsibility was shared. She welcomed that. It was the first time effort had meaning beyond survival. She learned new ingredients, new methods. Canadian winters required heavier stews, tighter kitchens, discipline that came from weather rather than cruelty. She adapted easily. Adaptation had always been her skill. At the freedom table, people lingered after meals, reluctant to leave warmth and company. They spoke of places left behind and futures imagined. Some planned to return south after the war. Others vowed never to cross that border again. Celia listened. She did not advise unless asked. When she spoke carefully. Do not wait for permission, she told a man considering a journey back to Mississippi. It does not come. Her words carried weight because they were not embellished. Meanwhile, Samuel's world widened. He learned history from books that mentioned slavery as a problem already solved. He learned geography that mapped borders his feet had crossed in darkness. He learned rhetoric, the art of making arguments sound reasonable to people who did not want to hear them. At home, Celia reminded him of what books left out. Remember who was missing, she said when he brought home lessons on freedom and law. Remember who paid for those words. He did. As the war ended and Reconstruction faltered, letters arrived from the South describing a different kind of hunger. Freed people promised land and protection found contracts instead. Laws shifted shape without changing intent. Violence learned new names. Celia read those letters silently. Freedom, she understood, did not end systems. It exposed them. She began hosting meals specifically for new arrivals who had fled north after discovering that emancipation did not mean safety. These dinners were quieter, more careful. Advice replaced celebration. Information replaced hope. Eat, she told them. Then listen. She taught them what she could, how to move through towns, how to read documents, how to recognize men who asked too many questions. The Underground Railroad had changed, but its logic had not. Attention still mattered. Back in Louisiana, Magnolia Grove finally disappeared as a place at all. The land was sold off in parcels. The house, already damaged, burned during an occupation whose details no one recorded carefully. Only the chimneys remained, standing alone in a field like ribs from a buried body. Local children dared each other to approach them. Older men crossed themselves and looked away. No one rebuilt there. Years later, when historians asked why, answers were vague. Bad soil. Poor location. Superstition. No one mentioned the cook. But hunger remembered. It remembered in the way the Beaumont's descendants never quite found their footing again. It remembered in the way former enslaved families settled that land and grew enough to eat, not excess. It remembered in the way stories continued to circulate long after names were lost. Celia grew old with those stories moving around her like weather. She did not correct them. She did not add to them. She let them become what they needed to be. On evenings when her hands ached too much to cook, she sat at the table anyway, listening to others' work. The sound of knives on boards. The low conversation. The ordinary music of a place where food meant sustenance, not power. Once, a visitor asked her if she ever felt guilty. For taking so much, the woman said, voice careful. Celia considered the question longer than she needed to. No, she said finally. I took back time. The woman nodded, though she did not fully understand. Most people did not. They thought of escape as a moment. Celia knew it was a practice, and she had practiced it until hunger changed sides completely. By the time Celia's hands finally stilled for good, the world had rearranged itself so thoroughly that Magnolia Grove felt like a rumor. Maps changed. Borders hardened. Laws multiplied. Yet something essential had shifted long before any amendment was signed or army disbanded. The certainty had cracked. Celia had sensed it that first winter in Canada, long before official news arrived. It showed up in small ways. In the posture of men who no longer assumed obedience. In women who asked questions out loud. In children who did not lower their eyes automatically when spoken to. Systems depend on habits more than force, and once habits are broken, force becomes clumsy. The Beaumonts never understood this. They believed their downfall had come from outside, abolitionists, war, northern interference. They searched for enemies they could name because naming something made it feel containable. What they could not face was that the collapse had begun in their dining room years earlier, when they stopped noticing who was feeding them. After the war, former enslaved families returned to East Feliciana Parish looking for kin, land, answers. They found ruins, chimneys, fields that no longer yielded the way they once had. The land had been worked too hard, pushed too far, drained by a system that demanded everything and replenished nothing. Some settled anyway. They built smaller houses, grew smaller crops, ate simpler meals. The abundance that once defined Magnolia Grove never returned, and no one seemed eager to resurrect it. Excess had left a bad taste. In St. Catharines, Celia watched the same lesson unfold from a distance. People asked her how she knew the moment had arrived, how she recognized the precise night to act. She never gave them a date, or a sign, or a feeling. I knew because they stopped being careful, she said. That is when you move. Carelessness, she understood, was the true signal of power failing. It showed itself in unlocked doors, in conversations held too loudly, in systems so confident they no longer protected themselves. She taught that lesson without drama. When her grandchildren grew older, she asked them questions instead of giving instructions. Why did someone assume they would stay? Why did another believe their comfort was permanent? Why did people who controlled so much still fear so little? The children answered as best they could. Some answers were wrong. She let them be wrong. Learning, she believed, required room to misjudge. Samuel visited often once his own children were grown. They spoke of schools, of policy, of the slow grind of progress that felt both enormous and insufficient. He told her about meetings where men nodded politely and did nothing afterward. They listen, he said once. They just do not change. Celia nodded. They will, she said. Later. When it costs them. That was not bitterness. It was observation. As age bent her posture and slowed her steps, Celia spent more time at the table without cooking. She watched others prepare meals, noting habits, patterns, strengths. She corrected gently when asked. She praised effort more than result. The freedom table had become something quieter, no longer a refuge in crisis, but a place of continuity. When she died, the town paused. Not because she was famous, but because she had been reliable. The kind of person whose absence altered daily rhythms. The market missed her purchases. The kitchen missed her corrections. The table missed her presence at its head, not in command but in attention. Afterward, people tried to explain her life in ways that made it easier to digest. They called her brave, clever, lucky. Each word contained a deflection. Each allowed distance. Those who knew better used different language. They said she was precise. They said she paid attention. They said she understood systems because she had been trapped inside one long enough to see its seams. That understanding mattered more than courage. Years later, when scholars debated how slavery truly unraveled, whether by war, economics, or moral pressure, Celia's name did not appear in their indexes. But her method did. In disguised form. In case studies. In footnotes that described internal failures rather than external shocks. Internal failures. The inability of power to imagine resistance where it believed dependency had settled. The blindness that comes from abundance. The fatal assumption that those who serve have nothing else to do but serve. Celia had exploited that assumption until it broke. She did not destroy Magnolia Grove with fire or steel. She let it collapse under its own weight. She removed what it relied on most, labor disguised as loyalty, obedience mistaken for consent, and watched gravity do the rest. That was why the story unsettled people long after the facts blurred. It suggested that freedom was not always seized in a single dramatic act, but assembled quietly over time from observation and restraint. That waiting was not the same as surrender. That kitchens could be command centers. And that sometimes, the most devastating rebellion was not loud enough to stop. It simply left. The system Magnolia Grove represented could not recover from that kind of loss. It required belief to function, the belief that those it exploited would remain in place, predictable, available. Celia took that belief with her when she walked north. Nothing they built afterward could replace it. And that absence, the absence of certainty, of unquestioned control, of a table that fed power endlessly, proved to be the hunger they never learned how to satisfy. In the years after Celia's death, the story continued doing what stories do best. It adapted. It traveled farther than she ever had, slipping into classrooms, sermons, kitchen conversations, and the private spaces where people measure their own courage against someone else's choices. Each telling shaved off a little discomfort and added a little polish. That was inevitable. But the core remained. A woman stayed when leaving too soon would have failed. A woman watched when watching looked like obedience. A woman left when leaving meant everything. What unsettled people most was not the theft or the escape, but the patience. The idea that resistance could look like compliance for years and still be resistance. That victory could be quiet and complete without ever asking permission. In St. Catherine's, Samuel kept his mother's habits alive without announcing them. He arrived early to meetings. He listened longer than others expected. He waited until people revealed what they truly believed by what they dismissed. Then he spoke, carefully, at the moment when words could no longer be ignored. When he retired, former students came to thank him. Many mentioned discipline, standards, fairness. A few mentioned how he never seemed surprised when institutions failed them. He said systems show you who they are if you watch long enough, one recalled. That sentence did not appear in any textbook. It came from a kitchen. Meanwhile, Magnolia Grove's land passed through hands that did not know its history. Farmers planted different crops. A road cut across part of the old acreage. Children rode bicycles where cotton once bled white into baskets. Progress, people said without irony. Yet every few years someone would find something in the soil. A rusted hinge. A shard of china. An iron fragment from a stove that no longer existed. Objects without stories until someone gave them one. An empty plate is not an object you can bury. It exists only in memory, in the place where expectation meets absence. That is why it survived. People who heard the story late sometimes asked the wrong question. Why didn't she leave sooner? Celia's answer, had she been there to give it, would have been simple. Because leaving sooner would have meant losing. She had waited until leaving meant victory. That distinction mattered. It meant the difference between escape and collapse. Between survival and consequence. Between one person running and an entire system stumbling after her, suddenly unsure of its footing. She had not dismantled slavery alone. No one story ever does. But she had exposed something essential about it, that it depended as much on attention as on force, on habit as on violence. Break the habit and the force falters. Celia's victory was quiet because it did not announce itself. It did not require applause. It did not demand recognition. It simply rearranged the future of everyone involved. Her son grew old free. Her grandchildren never learned the language of ownership. Her community fed itself. And the family who once believed the world existed to satisfy them learned, too late, what hunger felt like when no one rushed to fill it. In the end, that was the legacy she left behind, not the money, not the route north, not even the message on the table. It was the knowledge that patience, when paired with attention, could outlast cruelty. That waiting could be active. That silence could be strategic. And that power, when it stops watching, is already in decline. Celia never wrote her story down. She never corrected those who told it poorly. She never sought to be remembered. She had lived too long being observed to crave it. But the story found its way forward anyway because it answered something people kept asking in different centuries and different forms. How do you live inside a system designed to erase you? You learn it. You study it. You wait. And when the moment comes, you take back more than it ever imagined you could. That was her quiet victory. And it did not end when she did. What remains of Celia's story is not the distance she walked, though it was immense. It is not the money she took, though it was enough to ruin a family that believed wealth was proof of worth. It is not even the war that unfolded alongside her escape, loud and history-making. What remains is smaller, sharper, more unsettling. It is the understanding that power rarely falls from sudden blows. It weakens first through neglect, through assumptions, routines, appetites indulged too long. It weakens when those who believe themselves untouchable stop paying attention. Celia knew that. She did not need speeches or banners to prove it. She proved it with repetition, with meals served on time, with silence where others expected gratitude, with memory sharpened into strategy. Magnolia Grove did not die because an enslaved woman hated it. It died because she understood it. She understood how much the Beaumonts relied on her invisibility, how comfort made them careless, how appetite dulled vigilance, how a system that demanded everything from others could not survive the removal of a single, essential piece. When that piece walked away, the rest collapsed under its own weight. Years later, when scholars tried to isolate causes, economic pressure, military defeat, political change, they circled the truth without touching it. Systems fall when belief leaves them. Belief that things will continue as they always have. Belief that those who serve will remain in place. Belief that hunger only moves downward. Celia reversed that direction. She did not chase revenge. She did not linger to watch the ruin. She stepped into a future that had no guarantee except effort and uncertainty, and she built something durable there. A table where people ate without fear. A life where work produced dignity instead of depletion. A son who would never be priced or sold. That is what victory looked like to her. Quiet. Complete. Unapologetic. The empty plate she left behind was never meant as poetry. It was a fact. A record of absence. A declaration that the transaction had ended. For 17 years, pain had been consumed without consequence. That night the balance shifted. Those who found the plate later felt something they could not name. Not guilt. Not sorrow. A disturbance. As if the rules they trusted had failed them in a way no rulebook had prepared them for. They were right. Because Celia's story is not comforting. It does not promise rescue. It does not offer shortcuts. It does not suggest that endurance alone will save anyone. What it offers instead is harder. Attention. Patience. Timing. The knowledge that waiting is not the same as surrender, and silence is not the same as consent. The courage to leave only when leaving changes everything. That is why the story refuses to stay buried. It surfaces wherever people recognize themselves inside systems that profit from their exhaustion. It surfaces in kitchens, classrooms, offices, factories, anywhere usefulness is mistaken for loyalty. Celia would not have recognized herself as a symbol. She did not think in those terms. She thought in steps, in nights traveled, in hands held tightly through darkness, in meals that needed to be served just well enough to keep suspicion asleep. She thought like a survivor because survival had demanded it. And when survival became something more, when it became freedom, she accepted it without ceremony. The world did not change overnight because of her. But her world did. And sometimes, that is the most radical change of all. So when you think of Celia, do not picture chains breaking or doors splintering. Picture a woman standing quietly at the edge of a room, listening, counting, learning. Picture a system so confident in its control that it never noticed the moment it lost it. Picture an empty plate where something was expected. That absence is the lesson, and it has not stopped speaking. Final seat. What do you think this story is really about? Revenge, patience, or intelligence hidden in plain sight? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows for more dark historical narratives that uncover the truths history tried to erase. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who believes history is only made by loud moments. Some victories are quiet. Some voices were forced into silence. But these stories still need to be heard. See you in the next one.